Chapter 4. Settling in. Having made what I took to be a promising, if unorthodox, start on a social life, I set about arranging my apartment so I could live and work in it comfortably. For essential things like bookshelves, file cabinets and reading lamps, I visited a junk shop on the edge of town. It was cluttered, barn-like, a warehouse that extended far back into a series of rooms filled with formica dinette sets, sofas, office furniture, and all manner of machinery from washer-dryers to apple corers. The owner sat like a Buddha behind a desk, barking hellos to customers and instructions to his salesman. The salesman was an expressionless man in his mid-30s. He had mousy brown hair parted at the centre, and his arms hung loosely at his sides. His clothes were clean but faded, like the suits and shirts on a rack in one corner of the store. I was immediately impressed by the man's instant recall of the store's vast inventory. "We have 7 of that type of item," he would say. "One's like new, 4 work pretty good. One's broke but could be fixed, and the other's on layaway." In addition to having a mental catalogue of the place, the salesman was a virtuoso on the strengths and weaknesses of practically any brand of appliance, particularly brands no longer in existence. "Kelvinator made a good one in the early 50s, he said. "It had 5 speeds, it was real easy to clean, you could get replacement parts right quick." Impressed as I was by all that, I was struck even more by something else. A carefully applied arc of purple eyeshadow that blazed like a lurid sunset on his left eyelid. At first, I found it difficult to listen to what he was saying, distracted as I was by the eyeshadow. I wondered what nocturnal transformation was built around this painted eye. I envisioned a tiara and a strapless gown, a fluttering ostrich fan at the end of a long white glove. Or was this something quite different? Was it perhaps the war paint of punk? Did this mild-mannered man spend hours in his secret jackboots, ripped t-shirts and spiked hair? Eventually, my attention wandered back to what the man was saying, and I bought what it was he was showing me. The next week, I dropped in at the shop again, and this time I tried very hard not to stare at the purple eyeshadow on the man's left eye. From time to time, while he was waiting on me, the boss would shout questions from his desk about whether such and such an item was in stock. The salesman would cock an ear and call out the answer over his shoulder without looking directly at his boss. After one such exchange, the salesman said in a low voice, "What the boss doesn't know won't hurt him." "What do you mean?" I said. "He didn't like this," the salesman said, pointing to his left eye. "I don't do drag or anything sick like that. I just do my eyes. I used to do my other eye the same way too. The boss never told me to stop. The boss told me to stop, and I was all set to walk out the door and never come back. But then I figured, wait a minute, he never gets out of that chair, see? And my desk is over by his left side. If I only do the eye away from him, maybe he'll never notice." That was 2 years ago, and he ain't said nothing about it since. On my next visit to the shop, the salesman was out to lunch, but due back soon. The boss and I chatted. "Jack's a good man," he said, speaking of his salesman. "Best I ever seen. He's a strange one, though. He's a loner. This shop and everything in it is his whole life. I used to call him Jack the One-Eyed Jill. Not to his face, of course. He used to put on that eye makeup on both eyes, you know. God, it looked awful. I told him, I can't have this in my shop. No more, or you're out. So what he'd do? Came in the next day not wearing any eye makeup at all, as far as I could tell. But he was walking sideways around the store like a damn crab, twisting this way and that. Then he'd walk past a mirrored wardrobe and I saw it plain as day. He'd put the makeup on the other eye. I was ready to kick his butt clear out the door then and there. But he's good at what he does, and it don't seem to bother the customers. So I kept my mouth shut. And from that day to this, he's kept that eye turned away from me. He must take me for blind or some kind of idiot, but that's okay with me. He pretends he's not wearing makeup. I pretend I don't know he's ignored my wishes. Meanwhile, he keeps walking sideways, twisting around, speaking out the corner of his mouth and hoping I won't notice. And I'll make out like I don't. I don't know who's crazier, Jack the One-Eyed Jill or me. We get along just fine. Before long, I found myself settling into a pattern of a daily routine. An early morning jog around Forsyth Park, breakfast at Clary's drugstore, a late afternoon walk along Bull Street. I discovered that my activities coincided with the daily rituals of certain other people. No matter how widely our paths might have diverged for the rest of the day, we overlapped again and again at our appointed hour and place. The black man who jogged around Forsyth Park the same hour as I did was one such person. He was lean, very dark, and a little over 6 feet tall. When I fell in behind him the first time, I noticed he was carrying a short blue leather strap. Most of it was wound around his hand. 8 or 10 inches of it protruded. He snapped the free end of it against his thigh every other step, producing a rhythmic whap that forced me to run in step or very much out of step. I ran in step, that was easier. As he turned the corner at the south end of the park that first day, he looked back in my direction, but not quite at me, a little behind me. I looked over my shoulder. About 50 yards back there was a blonde woman jogging with a little terrier romping beside her. The next time I started my run, the blonde woman and her dog were running ahead of me. The dog would dart into the park and then double back to join her. As I drew near, she turned her head to look across the park to Drayton Street on the other side. The black man was jogging along Drayton, having already made both turns at the far end. He looked back at her. After this, I never saw one of them without also seeing the other. He always carried the little blue leather strap. She always had her dog with her. Sometimes he was in lead, sometimes she was. They were always separated by at least 100 yards. One day, I saw the man at the M&M supermarket booking a shopping cart. Another time, I caught sight of him getting into a late-model green Lincoln on Wright Square. But no blue strap and no blonde woman. A few days later, I saw the blonde woman coming out of a bank. She was unaccompanied, except for her terrier, who trotted along beside her. He was straining at the end of a blue leather leash. "We don't do black on white in Savannah," Joe Oden told me when I mentioned having seen this couple, "especially black male on white female. A lot may have changed here in the last 20 years, but not that. Badness is the only woman I know of who had a black lover and got away with it. Badness was the wife of an influential Savannah businessman, and she had lovers during most of her marriage. That was all perfectly acceptable. Savannah will put up with public infidelity, no matter how flagrant it is. Savannah loves it, can't get enough of it. But even Badness knew enough to leave Savannah and go to Atlanta when she felt the urge to have an affair with a black man. I understood all that, but I still wondered about certain small details concerning my jogging companions. Why, for instance, did he carry the leash? And when and where did they get close enough for her to give it to him? The whole point, I finally realized, was that I would never know. If I happened to be walking along Bull Street in the late afternoon, I would invariably see an old and dignified black man. He always wore a suit and tie, starched white shirt, and a fedora. His ties were muted paisleys and regimental stripes, and his suits were fine and well tailored, although apparently made for a slightly larger person. Every day at the same time, the old man walked around the cast iron gates of the grandiose Armstrong House at the north end of Forsyth Park. He turned left and proceeded up Bull Street all the way to City Hall and back. He was very much a gentleman. He tipped his hat and bowed in greeting, but I noticed that he and the people he spoke with usually well-dressed businessmen, played a very odd game. The men would ask him, "Still walking the dog?" It was perfectly clear that the old man was not walking a dog, but he would respond by saying, "Oh yes, still walking the dog." Then he would look over his shoulder and say to the air behind him, "Come on, Patrick," and off he would go. One day, as I came through Madison Square, I saw him standing by the monument facing a semicircle of tourists. He was singing. I could not make out the words, but I could hear his reedy tenor voice. The tourists applauded when he was done, and one of the lady tour guides slipped something into his hand. He bowed and left them. We approached the crosswalk at the same time. "That was very nice," I said. "Why, thank you kindly," he reported in his courtly tone. "Why, thank you kindly," he said in his courtly way. "My name is William Salmon Glover." I introduced myself and told Mr. Glover that it seemed we often took the same walk at the same hour. I said nothing about the dog, figuring the subject would come up on his own. "Oh yes," he said, "I'm 86 years old, and I'm downtown at 7 o'clock every morning. I'm retired, but don't stay still. I work as a porter for the law firm of Boohan, Williams and Levy. I work as a porter for the law firm of Boohan, Williams and Levy. I work as a porter for the law firm of Boohan, Williams and Levy." Mr. Glover's voice had a bounce to it. He pronounced the law firm as if an exclamation mark followed the... "I work as a porter for the law firm of Boohan, Williams and Levy." Mr. Glover's voice had a bounce to it. He pronounced the name of the law firm as if an exclamation mark followed each of the partners' names. "I'm a porter, but everybody knows me as a singer," he said as we started to cross the street. "I learned to sing in church when I was 12. I pumped the organ for a quarter while one lady played and another lady sang. I didn't know nothing about no German, French, or Italian. But me hearing the ladies sing so much, I learned to say the words whether I knew what they was or not. One Sunday morning, the lady didn't sing, so I sang instead, and I sang in Italian. I sang Hallelujah." "How did it go?" I asked him. Mr. Glover stopped and faced me. He opened his mouth wide and drew a deep breath. From the back of his throat came a high croaking sound. "Hallelujah! Hallelujah!" He had abandoned his tenor and was singing in a wavering falsetto. Forgetting his mind apparently, Hallelujah would be a soprano piece as sung by the lady in church so many years before. "Hallelujah! Hallelujah! 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 Hallelujah!" Mr. Glover stopped for a breath. "And then the lady always finished by singing Hallelujah." "So that was your debut," I said. "That's right. That's how I got started. That lady learned me to sing in French, German, and Italian. Oh, yes. And I've been musical director of the First African Baptist Church since 1916. I directed a chorus of 500 voices for Franklin D. Roosevelt when he visited Savannah on I directed a chorus of 500 voices for Franklin D. Roosevelt when he visited Savannah on November 18, 1933. I remember the date because that was the very day my daughter was born. I named her Eleanor Roosevelt Glover. I can remember the song we sang too, Come By Here. The doctor sent word up to me. Tell Glover he can sing Come By Here for the president all he damn pleases, but I'll just come by his house and he left a baby girl and I want him to come by my office and pay me $15. When we parted at the corner of Oglethorpe Avenue, I realised I was still in the dark about the imaginary dog, Patrick. A week or so later, when I next fell in step with Mr. Glover, I made a mental note to bring the subject around to it. But Mr. Glover had other things to talk about first.
You know about psychology, he said. You learn that in school. You learn peopleology on the Pullman. I was a porter for the Pullman during the war. You had to keep the passengers well satisfied for them to tip you 50 cents or $1. You say, wait a minute, sir. You're going up the club car. Your tie's crooked. Now his tie's really straight as an arrow. But you pull it crooked and then you pull it straight again and he likes it. That's peopleology. Keep a whisk broom in your pocket and brush him off. You don't need no brushing off, but you don't know it. Brush him off anyhow and straighten his collar. Pull it crooked and straighten it again. Miss Mammy don't need a box for her hat, but you don't be sure and put a box in her hat. No. Miss Mammy don't need a box for her hat, but you be sure and put her hat in a box. If you sit and do nothing, you won't get nothing. Another thing I learned. Don't ever ask a man, how is Mrs. Brown? You ask him, how is Miss Julia? Tell her I ask about her. I never did ask Mr. Boohan about Mrs. Boohan. I asked him, how is Miss Helen? Tell Miss Helen I ask about her. He liked it and she liked it. Mr. Boohan gave me his old clothes and shoes. Miss Helen gave me records from her collection. All kinds of records. I got records and I don't even know I got. I ain't even got a record player. Nope. I even got records of that great opera singer, Henry Cocoroso. I keep busy, Mr. Glover said. I don't sit down and hold my hand. I got $500 of life insurance, and it's all paid up. I paid 25 cents a week for 70 years. And last week, the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company sent me a check for $1,000.
Mr. Glover's eyes were sparkling.
No, sir, I don't sit down and hold my hand. Glover,
came a booming voice from behind us. A tall, white-haired man in a grey suit approached. Still walking the dog?
Why, yes, sir, I am.
Mr. Glover did his little bow and tipped his hat and gestured to the invisible dog behind him.
I'm still walking, Patrick.
Glad to hear it, Glover. Keep up now. Take care. With that, the man walked away. How long have you been walking Patrick? I asked. Mr. Glover straightened up.
Oh, for a long time. Patrick was Mr. Boohan's dog. Mr. Boohan used to give him Chivas raw scotch to drink. I walked the dog, and I was the dog's bartender too. Mr. Boohan said that after he died, I was to be paid $10 a week to take care of Patrick. He put that in his will. I had to walk him and buy his scotch liquor. When Patrick died, I went to see Judge Lawrence. The judge was Mr. Boohan's executor. I said, Judge, you can stop paying me $10 now because Patrick is dead. And Judge Lawrence said, what do you mean Patrick is dead? How could he be? I see him right there on the carpet. I look behind me and I don't see no dog. But then after a minute I said, oh, I think I see him too, Judge. And the judge said, good. So you just keep walking him and we'll keep paying you. The dog is now dead 20 years, but I still walk him. I walk up and down Bull Street and I look over my shoulder and I say, come on, Patrick.